On one night in July 1969, America didn't just win a race. America rewrote what humanity believed was possible. While the world watched in disbelief, a Saturn V roared into the sky carrying 3 Americans and an entire nation's nerve toward the most impossible destination of the century. And when the signal finally came from the Sea of Tranquility, it wasn't just history. It was a message heard in every capital on Earth. The future had an American voice. For years, the Soviet Union had been first. Sputnik, then Yuri Gagarin, then a string of achievements that made it feel like the future was leaning east. In those early days of the space age, the headlines didn't just report science. They shaped confidence, alliances, and fear. America felt the pressure in its politics, in its pride, and in the quiet question that hung over every new Soviet success. If they can do that up there, what else can they do? But the American response wasn't just anger or envy. It was resolve, turned into a national promise so bold it sounded almost reckless. Before the decade ended, the United States would land a man on the moon and bring him safely home. Not try, not maybe, do it. And that's what people sometimes miss when they look back. Apollo wasn't only a mission, it was a commitment to execution at a scale the world had never seen. It meant building rockets bigger than anything that had ever flown, inventing machines that had never existed, testing systems until failure became a teacher, and then testing again. It meant engineers and technicians, mathematicians and machinists, launch crews and flight controllers, all turning the same direction at once, toward a target 250,000 miles away. It meant accepting a truth that is hard to stomach even now. You can plan brilliantly and still lose everything in seconds. America learned that in blood in January 1967, when a fire during a test took the lives of 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. It was a brutal reminder that the moon was not a stage set. It was a frontier, and frontiers take payment. NASA stopped, reworked, redesigned, and rebuilt. The program didn't move forward by pretending it was invincible. It moved forward by confronting risk honestly, by making the system safer, the procedures sharper, and the culture more disciplined. That's part of what made Apollo credible. It carried the scars of hard lessons, not the illusion of easy triumph. By July 1969, the moon was no longer a dream. It was an appointment. On July 16th at Kennedy Space Center, Apollo 11 rose on a Saturn V, 3 stages of controlled violence, carefully engineered to turn fuel into destiny. The rocket shook the air and the ground, a sound that didn't just announce liftoff. It announced commitment. Inside were Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Armstrong was the commander, calm, precise, known for flying right up to the edge without wasting motion. Aldrin was the lunar module pilot, sharp, analytical, a man who understood both the math and the moment. Collins would pilot the command module, staying in orbit around the moon while the other 2 descended. That detail matters, because it contains its own kind of courage. Collins would be alone, circling the far side, temporarily cut off from radio contact, holding the lifeboat while history happened below. From the start, Apollo 11 was watched as a global event, but the eyes on it were not all friendly. The Soviet Union watched with intense interest, not because they were cheering, but because they understood the moon landing as a strategic earthquake. In the Cold War, symbols were power. The nation that could do the impossible, publicly, convincingly, and on time, could persuade the world that its system worked better. That mattered to allies. It mattered to neutral countries trying to choose who to trust. It mattered to domestic pride. And it mattered in the quiet internal calculations of leadership. What does it say about your rival if they can land on the moon? The mission unfolded with a kind of disciplined grace that hid its danger. Apollo 11 traveled to the moon, performed a crucial engine burn to enter lunar orbit on July 19th, and prepared for the most delicate phase of all. The lunar module, named Eagle, separated from the command module, Columbia. Collins stayed with Columbia, keeping it stable, checking systems, and waiting. Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into Eagle and began the descent. And this is where the story stops being a parade and becomes a tightrope. The moon has no air, no runway, no room for improvisation in the usual sense. If you come in too fast, you don't bounce, you die. If your computer fails, you don't pull over, you vanish into the dust. Eagle was guided by a computer that, by modern standards, was astonishingly limited. And during the descent, alarms began to appear, alerts that could have meant overload, confusion, or failure. In mission control, the atmosphere turned surgical. Controllers and engineers evaluated those alarms in seconds. They determined the system could continue. The descent went on, but the margin was shrinking. The planned landing area wasn't turning out to be as friendly as hoped, and Armstrong could see they were headed toward rough terrain. Boulders, craters, a place that looked like it would bite the lander's legs and flip it. He took manual control. That moment is one of the purest demonstrations of what Apollo really was. Not only machines, but human judgment under pressure. Armstrong wasn't performing for cameras. He was flying for survival. He guided Eagle to a safer patch, watching fuel tick down. The world did not hear the frantic inner noise because Apollo wasn't broadcast like entertainment. It was broadcast like truth, clipped voices, technical calls, long stretches of waiting. In mission control, the fuel callouts tightened, time thinned, and then, finally, the sentence came through, steady and understated for what it meant. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. In that instant, the impossible became a location. Across the United States, people erupted, at home, at work, in streets, in bars. But the emotional wave wasn't only American. Humanity felt it. The planet had watched human beings step beyond Earth in earlier missions, but the moon was different. The moon was not up there in the vague sense. The moon was another world, a place you can see with your own eyes from your backyard. And now Americans were on it. And yes, the Soviet Union was listening. The phrase, "the Kremlin went silent," works as an image because it captures something real. When you are the rival of a nation that has just achieved a global symbol, you don't have an easy slogan that cancels it. You can't erase what everyone just witnessed. You can't laugh it off without sounding small. You can't call it fake without proving you're either dishonest or ignorant, especially when you have the scientific and technical ability to track space missions and understand what you're hearing. The Soviet leadership faced a hard reality that night. The world had just watched a victory that could not be undone. There was another reason that reality hit hard, and it was happening almost simultaneously. While Apollo 11 was making its final approach, the Soviet Union had its own spacecraft near the moon. Luna 15, an unmanned mission launched days earlier. Its goal was to land and return lunar soil to Earth, an attempt to secure a notable achievement even if America put men on the surface first. The timing alone tells you how intense the rivalry was. While Apollo 11 prepared to land, the Soviet program was also trying to write its own headline. NASA, aware of the proximity, was concerned about possible interference or collision risk in lunar orbit. In an extraordinary and very real moment of pragmatic cooperation, communications occurred at a high level to ensure that Luna 15's path wouldn't endanger Apollo 11. It's one of those details that feels surprising. Even at the height of Cold War rivalry, both sides understood that an accident at the moon would be a disaster that could poison everything. After Eagle landed, Armstrong and Aldrin prepared for the first moonwalk. The plan originally allowed for rest, but adrenaline and the weight of history had their own schedule. Hours later, Armstrong climbed down the ladder, and the world watched a boot touch lunar dust. He spoke words that would be replayed forever, a sentence that framed the moment not as a conquest, but as a milestone for the species. Then Aldrin followed, and together they moved with careful, bouncing steps across a landscape that looked both dead and holy, quiet, unchanging, untouched by wind or weather. They collected samples, set up experiments, and planted the American flag. The flag mattered, not because the moon could belong to anyone, but because the flag was a signal, an emblem of who had brought humans there first. If you want the patriotic heart of this story, the part that makes Americans feel proud without slipping into fantasy, it's right here. This was not luck. This was not a stunt. It was the result of a democratic society deciding openly and publicly that it would pursue a goal so difficult that failure would be visible to the entire world. The United States put its reputation on the line in front of rivals, allies, and ordinary people. And then it built the capability to deliver. Apollo 11 was not one brilliant day. It was 1,000 hard days stacked on top of each other, forming a staircase to the moon. Now, while the world watched Americans walk on the lunar surface, Luna 15 attempted its own descent. The Soviet spacecraft ultimately failed and crashed into the moon on July 21st, while Apollo 11 was still in the area. That contrast is stark, and it's real. The United States had landed humans and conducted an EVA, while the Soviet robotic competitor did not complete its goal. If you want a moment that quietly explains why the Soviet response was controlled rather than triumphant, that's one of them. They weren't just watching a rival succeed. They were watching their own parallel effort fail in real time under the shadow of America's achievement. And this brings us to a hard truth about the Soviet lunar effort, one that makes the moon landing feel even more decisive. In 1969, the Soviet Union was struggling with its own super-heavy rocket program, the N-1, designed to send cosmonauts to the moon. The program was secretive, politically complicated, and plagued by catastrophic failures. One of the most devastating N-1 failures happened on July 3, 1969, just weeks before Apollo 11, when a launch attempt ended in a massive explosion that destroyed infrastructure and set the program back badly. The Soviet public did not see those failures on television, because Soviet prestige was protected by silence. But Soviet leadership and engineers knew the truth. While America was preparing to land men on the moon, the Soviet path to doing the same was breaking apart. That context matters, because it explains why the Soviet Union did not respond to Apollo 11 with wild denial. If Moscow had truly believed the landing was staged, calling it out would have been the propaganda victory of the century. They did not do that. Instead, the Soviet response acknowledged the achievement while trying to control how emotionally dominant it became. They could respect it without celebrating it. They could admit it without letting it become a national humiliation. That's what rivals do when confronted with undeniable proof. They manage the narrative because they cannot change the event. And the proof wasn't only a broadcast image. Apollo 11 was a real spacecraft moving through space with real physics, real telemetry, and real radio communication. Multiple countries and institutions tracked the mission's signals and trajectory. The Soviet Union had the technical capability to monitor it as well. The moon landing was not an isolated claim. It was an observable phenomenon in the broader context of global space tracking. Even if ordinary people argue today from the comfort of hindsight and conspiracy, the governments and scientific communities of 1969 were living in the hard world of measurable reality. Apollo 11's mission profile could be followed. Its timing could be checked. Its behavior could be compared against what was possible. The Soviet Union might have been furious. Some might have been stunned. Many engineers likely felt a grudging admiration, but they couldn't treat it like a rumor, because it wasn't one. Back on the moon, the time came for the most underrated moment of the entire mission: leaving. Think about it plainly. There is no rescue on the moon. There is no alternate engine. The ascent stage of the lunar module had to ignite and carry Armstrong and Aldrin back into lunar orbit. If it failed, 2 Americans would be stranded forever on another world, and history would take a darker shape. This wasn't melodrama. The White House had even prepared a contingency statement in case the astronauts could not return, an acknowledgement that success was not guaranteed. That's how serious this was. That's how close greatness always is to loss. The ascent engine did ignite. Eagle rose from the lunar surface and met Columbia in orbit. The rendezvous and docking had to be executed with precision because orbital mechanics are unforgiving. Collins brought the command module into position, and the crew reunited. In that moment, Apollo 11 stopped being a bold claim and became a completed feat in progress. They had done the hardest part. Now they had to get home. The return journey carried its own tension, but it also carried something new: certainty. The mission had already changed the world. When Apollo 11 splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th, it didn't merely end a flight. It sealed a historical verdict. America had set a goal in full view of the world, absorbed the cost, corrected through tragedy, built a system equal to the task, and delivered what it promised before the decade ended. So what happened in Moscow? What happened in the Soviet worldview when America touched the moon? The honest answer is not a single dramatic scene, because history is rarely that neat. The silence was strategic. It was controlled. It was the pause of a rival recalculating. The Soviet Union continued its space program, and it continued to achieve remarkable things. But the psychological high ground shifted. Apollo 11 wasn't just a technical milestone. It was a demonstration of national capacity at a scale that was difficult to dismiss. It showed what the United States could do when it focused its resources, coordinated industry, and empowered experts to solve problems. It showed an ability to execute a complex mission with tight timing, under public scrutiny, with failure visible to the entire world. That kind of proof changes how your rivals see you, because it implies you can do other enormous things too. And that's the core of the pride Americans still feel about Apollo 11. It's not pride in conquering the moon as property. It's pride in a moment when the country's best qualities, ambition, innovation, discipline, courage, and teamwork, aligned with a goal that seemed absurd until the instant it became real. It was a victory not only of astronauts, but of thousands of people who never left Earth and still moved the moon closer by doing their jobs with excellence. If you want to understand the final impact, the reason this story still hits people decades later, listen to the way the mission is remembered. Not as a brag, but as a proof of capability. The moon landing became a reference point for what Americans believe about themselves when they're at their best. That there are moments when the country can look at something impossibly far away and decide it will not be intimidated by distance, by doubt, or by the fact that nobody's ever done it before. That's why the night mattered. The moon was quiet before Apollo 11, silent in the way only lifeless worlds can be. But after July 1969, the moon carried a human footprint and a human message. It reminded the world that history doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the proudest claim. It belongs to the side that can build, endure, and deliver under pressure. And on that night, under the gaze of an entire planet and the attention of its greatest rival, America delivered. If this story moved you, if it made you feel even a fraction of what people felt in 1969, pride, awe, and that rare belief that the impossible can become real, then you already understand what Apollo 11 truly was. Not just a mission, a moment when America touched the moon, and the world listened.